Hi guys. So in today's lecture, we're going to talk about population ecology. This is basically the unit where we learn about how we measure populations and predict their overall trends. So the first thing we need to know is some of our characteristics of a population. So what is a population? The definition of a population is a group of individuals that belong to the same species living in the same area at the same time, all right? So all of the lions of the world are not necessarily a population, but all the lions in the Serengeti that live together as a pride, that is a population of lions. So they have to be in the same area at the same time. All right, so we have a lot of important characteristics of a population. One is, of course, population size. This is usually one of the main factors that ecologists are concerned with when they're tracking how a group of organisms is doing. Is their population growing, stable, or decreasing? Also, geographic distribution. So how are they spread out along the landscape? Density of the species, which can affect their geographic distribution. Do they clump together like a pride of lions, or do they spread apart evenly into their territory like tigers do? All right, dispersion is along the same thing as how they are dispersed. Growth rate, how quickly can they grow if their numbers are small? Age structure, is the population made of more older individuals or younger individuals? Right. That's just for fun. All right, so let's talk about population size and how we measure population size and keep track of these things. So population size is the number of individuals in that population, obviously. So most of the time you can't go in and just actually count the number of individuals in a population. You have to have mathematic ways to estimate the size of the population. Can you imagine diving into this ocean despite the shark and trying to count all these little fish? It just would not happen. So size is a very important property of a population and it's very difficult to measure. Right? So you can see how the fish are constantly moving, and so trying to count them one at a time would be incredibly difficult, especially with a predator around. So imagine having a population of daisies that live in a field. This is a little easier to measure because these guys are not moving around. However, you could also have really, really huge numbers in there that would just make it very tedious. So plants are immobile, which means they cannot move, and they are confined to a relatively small area. And so then if you have a small area, even if there's large numbers, it is possible to count them. So we could simply just go in and count the individual plants in the field. But more often, individuals in a population are very hard to count because they are too widespread. So there's too much area to go around and try to count. They're too abundant. That's why I was back to if there's huge numbers, you're not going to be able to do that. Or they're mobile. And if they're mobile, then they move like the fish we saw in the previous one. And it can be very, very difficult to count those species. So when we look at counting species, we need to be concerned with geographic distribution. That's the range of the population. How much space does it take to maintain that population? So different species have different kinds of distribution. So the range can vary both in size, right? It may just be a few centimeters if you're talking about mold on a piece of bread or bacteria, or the range may be huge, such as the migration of whales. With a lot of whale species, we're still unaware of all the area that they travel to because we have not tracked all of that migration. We also need to be aware of their density. All right, population density is the number of individuals per unit area. Okay, so you have to define a certain amount of area and then count how many would be found within that area. These are blue-footed boobies. They're hilarious. All right, so sometimes you are very, very densely packed. So like these crabs here or the mushrooms above have super high density for their population. They're all in one area. And then sometimes animals like to have their own little territory, like the blue-footed boobies over there. They're each on their own little rock, and if they get too close to each other, they're going to peck at each other and let each other know that they're irritated. They don't want to be in each other's space. So dispersion is the spatial distribution of individuals within the population. And there's three main types of dispersion. Right? There is clumped dispersion. Okay. There is even dispersion or uniform, where they all have their own little space, like these penguins here. And then there is random dispersion. So in nature, we see a lot of clump dispersion because organisms tend to clump around resources, access to things like food, water, mates, habitat like shelter. Random dispersion tends to be more plants because they just release their seeds into the air or animals spread them for them, and so they just kind of land up willy-nilly all over the place. Uniform dispersion happens either when humans do something with plants, like imagine planting plants on a farm where each apple tree has its own little space right in a row, or when animals are territorial, like these penguins are. They all have their little space, and penguins are kind of funny because part of the time they're uniform and other parts of the time they're clumped, depending on what the conditions of the environment are. So going into clumped here, clump dispersion, the individuals are clustered together, hence clumped. All right, it occurs when resources such as food, water, living spaces are clumped together. All right, they're trying to get their resources. Clump distributions may also occur because a species has a certain social behavior. Back to our pride of lions, right? Where they have a male, one or two males that protect the females, and the females actually hunt for the males, and that is their social behavior. Herding animals that you see, they clump together for part of the year when they're going in search of resources. Flocks of birds, schools of fish, hives of bees. So sometimes they're doing this for protection as well. All right, uniform or even distribution is when they are separated by fairly even distance, their territory. All right. That is the result of them trying to get far away from each other as possible. All right, they don't want to be right near each other. So these penguins show even dispersion because of aggressive interactions that occur between the neighbors. So basically, they have their eggs there, and they all want their own little space, and if they get too close, they will strike out with their beaks at their neighbors. And random dispersion, like I said, is when the individual is independent of the location of other individuals, and so it's just willy-nilly wherever they land. And these dandelions are a perfect example. Their little seeds blow off into the wind, and they just go wherever they go, or animals can carry them in their fur. So population growth rate is really important to measure as well. If more individuals are being born than die in a given period of time, the population will increase. You have more births than deaths, that adds organisms to that population. If the birth rate is equal to the death rate, the population will remain stable. If the death rate is greater than the birth rate, the population will decline. So when we're looking at these populations, in order to predict what's going to happen, we use these things called age structure diagrams. We will talk about these more when we get into human population growth specifically. Okay. But what the age structure is the distribution of individuals among different ages in a population. How many young people do you have versus old people? If you have a population that is filled with old people but have very few young people, that can be very problematic for a population because the old people will be unable to reproduce. And with very few young people to continue the population, that population could go extinct rather rapidly. So what you really want your age structure diagram to look in most species is to have more young than old. Age structures are often represented in graphs. Okay, they look like this. And so if you look at this, you can see the blue is the men's side and the women is the red side. And the ages are on the side, and you can see at age 0 to 4 is the biggest category. So lots of young in this case. All right, and then as you get older, most of the people in this population are dying off by the time they reach 80. So lots of babies are being born, but they die at a fairly young age. I mean, 80 is not that young, but a fairly young age. So the future growth of a population is predicted using these diagrams. So if you have a large number young, just like I said, you're predicted to have higher growth rate because you have more individuals that can reproduce into the future and produce more kids, and then will just keep being shaped like a pyramid that gets bigger and bigger at the bottom. So then we get to survivorship curves. What this has to do with is how an organism reproduces. So the mortality of the individuals in the population generally follows one of 3 patterns. And you can see on the graph we have type 1, type 2, and type 3 in Roman numerals. So these are called survivorship curves because they show the likelihood of survival at different ages. All right, so it's all about how likely you are to survive based on your age. So if we look at type 1 survivorship curve, of which our example on the graph is humans. So when we look at this curve is flat at the start. So remember, this is percentage of lifespan. So when at 0 is you're just born, right? And 100 is when you're really old. And this is adjusted for different species that have different lifespans. And on the side is the number of survivors. So with humans, early on in life, we have a very high survival rate. Very few humans die when they are young. And then as we age, we get over 50, we start having health issues and stuff, and so our population starts to decline, and as we approach old age, it declines rather rapidly at that point. So it drops steeply at the end, indicating a high death rate as we become older. All right. So organisms that do this are typically large mammals that produce very few offspring. So with that, there is a lot of parental care. So if you think about humans, we typically don't have a lot of babies and we take care of them. Or if you think about elephants, all right, elephants are pregnant for 22 months and they take a lot of care with their babies early on so that they survive to old age. All right, so they provide them with good care. Then we have type 2 survivorship curve. This is the one in the middle. Type 2, the curve is intermediate between the 2 curves. All right, it's kind of in between. There is a constant death rate over the whole lifespan. So basically, age is not associated with the death rate. So an example of this could be like the Komodo dragon down here. The Komodo dragon has an equal death rate regardless if they are young or old. So it does not change through the whole lifetime. So rodents typically fall in this category because they have a lot of babies, but babies get picked off, but they also get picked off when they're young and they get picked off when they're old because they are just a prey item. So rodents and lizards see this kind of survivorship curve because they're prey items. Then we have type 3 survivorship curve. Type 3 curve drops sharply at the beginning, indicating a very high death rate among the young. So this flattens out as they get older. So in other words, if they reach adulthood, they typically survive until old age, but very few of them actually reach adulthood. All right, so decline for the few that do survive, the early die-off is very low. It flattens out, okay? So this would include organisms that produce really large numbers of offspring, but provide them with little or no care. So you can think of like frogs, for example. Frogs can lay, depending on the species, thousands of eggs. They lay those eggs, and some of them stick around for a while, and some of them don't. The eggs hatch out into tadpoles. There's very little parental care, if any, and lots of the tadpoles die off early before they even make it to adult frogs. They're a prey item, they're eaten in very large numbers, but if they make it to adulthood, they have a good chance of making it to a point where they can reproduce themselves. So examples are fish, many plants, and most marine invertebrates. Invertebrates are things without vertebrae, so think of lobsters and crabs. So this reproduction comes kind of in two forms with these survivorship curves. We have this kind of reproduction called Big Bang reproduction. These are organisms that produce all of their offspring in one big single event, all right? And that's what salmon do down here at the bottom. They spawn once in their life. When they go up the rivers, they all release all their eggs and all their sperm, and shortly thereafter, they die because the process of going up the river is so exhausting to them. All right, octopi also do this. So the octopus will go in, lay all their eggs. She will starve herself while she takes care of those eggs and blow water over them with her siphon until she dies. And those little octopi will be born out into the ocean independent of the parent. All right, so here's the salmon. They spend several years growing and maturing out in the ocean, and then near the end of their life, they spawn, producing millions and millions of eggs, followed by death. All right, and when all these eggs are spawned, it's still a type 3 survivorship curve. A lot of them are going to die right at the beginning, but those that make it out into the ocean might survive to adulthood, and then once they're adults, they typically survive until it's time to have their Big Bang reproduction again. Then we got repeated reproduction, and that's what we as humans are used to. Repeated reproduction in organisms is when you produce very few offspring each year for several years. So this is nice as an organism because if you are unsuccessful in one year, the next year you can try again. So what determines which type of reproduction an organism will have? It's determined by their survival rate, so what kind of predators or habitat they are dealing with. So there's our frogs with all of their eggs. If the survival rate of the offspring is low, it's more likely to have Big Bang reproduction. They know a lot of them are going to be picked off, so if they make huge numbers, there's a better chance for some of them to escape and then be able to grow into an adult and keep the species going. If the adults are more likely to survive and reproduce again, repeated reproduction will be favored. There are trade-offs in reproduction survival. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that reproduction requires a lot of time and energy and resources for the species to do this. If all the resources are used up during reproduction, then their survival is in jeopardy. So if resources are low, species may not reproduce, or if they do, they may die immediately after. If all the resources are needed for survival, then reproduction cannot occur. If you're starving, you cannot carry a fetus to term. All right, that's where we're going to stop with this lecture. And we will pick up the rest of populations lecture next week. So make sure you submit your note sheet, guys. Bye.